jargons and people are a bit lost. And unfortunately for me, I'm the only one that will be speaking today. On Friday, we had a panel of 4 persons, and we could hear different perspectives on wills and codicils. Today, I will be the only one standing here, privileged to do that on behalf of the legal team, and we'll be talking about human rights. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for this morning. Thank you for bringing us once again. As we share in the knowledge that we are privileged to have, we pray that every person will go back home with one thing that will help improve their lives and also in working with you in Jesus' name. Help me to speak with clarity and to the understanding of everybody. In Jesus' name I pray. So like I said, we'll be talking about human rights. Largely focus on the fundamental rights as we have them in the Nigerian Constitution. There are about 11 of them, but we'll be speaking on only 9. Hopefully, when time permits, at another session of the Legal Week, we'll be able to talk about those other rights. So it's a presentation, it's not a sermon, and I hope we'll be able to follow as we go through. It will be divided into 4 sessions. One is what are human rights? Secondly, we'll be talking about what are these rights in the Constitution. Thirdly, we'll be talking about how to enforce your rights. Fourthly, what are the limitations to your rights? And then I'll conclude with some verses from the Bible. So we'll go in that fashion. So the first thing is, what are rights? What are human rights? I believe that if we ask people will have different views as to what exactly we say are human rights. Some will say that they are divine rights. These are rights that came from God. Some call them natural rights because they are part of human nature, that you ought to have these rights. Others will say they are what belongs to human beings. So you'll find that in any of these definitions, there are key principles that you'll be able to pick from there. However, I will restrict my definition to what the United Nations say are human rights. And the UN says human rights are rights that are inherent in all human beings, regardless of their race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or other status. So every human being is entitled to these rights, regardless of your status in life and regardless of where you come from. There are certain key themes that we can pick from this definition. Like I said, the first one is that these are rights that belong to every one of us, as long as you are a human being. From your birth to death, you have these fundamental rights as a human person. The second thing that we see in these rights is that they are fundamental in the sense that if you don't have these rights, or these rights are not enforced for your benefit, it may be difficult for you to realize your potential in life. So, for instance, if you are a business person, if you don't have the right to move, for instance, how do you trade? If you don't have the right to attend school, how do you exercise your freedom of thought? If you don't have the right, to come to church, for instance, how do you exercise your freedom of religion? So these rights are intrinsic to every human being, and they are important for us to be able to realize our potentials in life. The third thing is that these rights are not granted by the government. Like we said, they are inherent in everybody as a human person. What we expect the government to do is to help enforce those rights, is to help promote them, to help protect them, and to ensure that these rights are not violated by either individuals or groups. Perhaps the last thing I would say about these rights also is that they are intrinsically linked. They are linked, so these rights are not independent of each other. So let me give one example. If you have the rights to movement and you don't have the right to life, it is difficult for you to enjoy that right of movement. In the same way, if you have the freedom of association, and you don't have the right to move, it's difficult for us to associate with other persons. So these rights are linked one to the other. And like I said, the key right that we have as human beings is our right to life, and without which other rights cannot be enjoyed. Historically, if you look at human civilization, these rights have been a subject of discussion. Before colonialism, for instance, you have slave trade. And in fact, those who fought for the abolition of slave trade, one of their major planks of argument is that it is a violation of the rights of every human being. You're not supposed to be subjected to slavery. And when for us it came to colonialism, one of the issues that people raised in terms of fighting colonialism was the fact that we have a right to self-determination. We have the right to choose leaders who will be able to govern us. And the fact that there are people who came from somewhere to invade our land and subject them to their own rules and caprices was a violation of the rights of persons. And of recent, of course, we've been talking about our rights to vote. We say that our votes must count. It is also our own right, our democratic right, to be able to choose leaders, that will govern us. Perhaps one of the rights that we most talk about in Nigeria today is our rights to life. And this has arisen because of a lot of insecurity in the land. People are being kidnapped, people are killed. You have Boko Haram in the northeast, and then you have people fighting farmers and herders in different communities, especially in the north-central part of Nigeria. And therefore, we continue to talk about people's right to life, people's right to live in areas that they want to live without any form of molestation. And for us as Christians, these rights are not supposed to be alien to us. Because if you look at the Bible, even though you can't go to a particular book in the Bible and say these are our bills of rights, just like we have chapter 4 in the Constitution where we have a whole set of rights that are guaranteed. Even though you can't go into the Bible and say, okay, these are the set of rights, that we have. But going through it, you will see that God has designed, human beings in such a way that they are entitled to exercise those rights. Yesterday, I was discussing with my children on what they understand by human rights. Can they give me examples of human rights? And one of the rights they mentioned is, freedom of speech. And I asked, why is it important? And the response is that, look, if God didn't want us to exercise our right to speak, He wouldn't have given us mouths to talk. So intrinsically, God designed us to exercise rights. If God didn't want us to exercise the right of movement, it's possible we wouldn't have legs. We would have just been confined to one place. So for us as Christians, it shouldn't be something that is alien. And also if you look at, the life of Jesus Christ, with all the preachings, the examples He has given and the people He has helped during His ministry, most especially poor people, people that are oppressed, and the whole concept of human rights is to ensure that there is justice and that people are not oppressed, in view of their status in life. There are two classical examples that we have in the Bible, which lawyers say, well, one could say that God was demonstrating that, look, people have certain rights. The first one is if you look at the story of the fall of man. When Adam and Eve, breached the law that God told them, not to breach. God called them, and what He did was to ask them why they did what they did. And He allowed them to respond. He gave them that right to be heard, which is very important. The right of fair hearing is important to every human being. In whatever circumstance that you find yourself, especially when it comes to determining your rights or your obligations, you need to be heard before a judge can pass a judgment. So God gave them that, opportunity to be heard. The second example, too, also relates to Adam and after God has passed judgment on them. The Bible told us that, when they committed that sin, that what they did was to look for leaves to cover their nakedness. Okay? But when God came, he decided to, give them skin, to cover their nakedness. And it is argued that, look, God also knew that to safeguard the dignity of every human being, you need some covering. So it is wrong, for instance, sometimes we see people arrested for one offense or the other and they are paraded naked in the town. It is not right. It's a violation of their dignity, to their human persons. So let's go into what are these rights in the Constitution of Nigeria. Like I said, it's found in chapter 4 of the Constitution. Sometimes distinctions are made between the different categories of rights that we have. Largely, chapter 4 contains what we call the civil and political rights. Chapter 2 of the Constitution looks at what is called the social and economic rights, but those ones, you can't go to court to enforce them. So even though you have a right to education in the Constitution, you can't go and, compel the government that that is a right that needs to be enforced by a court of law. Those are rights that we call are not justiciable. That is, you cannot go to court to enforce them. But the rights that we'll be looking at, in chapter 4, are those rights that you can go to court to enforce them, and government has an obligation to ensure that they are promoted and protected. So in section 33, the first right is our right to life. That's the first right we have. And I think in the hierarchy of rights, one could say that this is very key and important. Like we said earlier, if you don't have a right to life, it is difficult for you to exercise any of those rights, that we have in the Constitution. And what does that mean? Simply means that your right cannot be taken away from you intentionally. Let me just mark that word, intentionally. So it's your entitlement to exist. And like I said, it is important because all other rights depend on the right to life. There are three key things I would want us to know about these rights. The first one is that even though the right is personal and individual to you, you cannot waive it. So I have a right to life, but I cannot waive my right to life. In some other countries, they have what they call euthanasia, mercy killing. And they allow that. So for instance, somebody is sick, and the only lifeline he has is the oxygen that is, coming to him. You are allowed to ask the doctors to just remove it so that you can die. But we don't have that in Nigeria, So you cannot waive your right to life for any reason or for any cause whatsoever. There are people who commit suicide. Of course, by the time they die, there's nothing anybody can do. You can't arrest the dead person. But God helped that person that in the course of committing suicide, he did not die. It becomes an offense. So attempted suicide is an offense in Nigeria. So if anybody wants to kill himself or herself, ensure that you go. Otherwise, you go and spend your life in jail. We have situations where what I call traditional bulletproof. I believe people know what I'm talking about. Babalawo will call it jazz. People will go and take some concoctions and say, okay, even if you shoot me, I wouldn't die. And then they will give somebody a gun. Can you try and see whether I will go? In some situations, it has failed, and the person dies. You that was asked to shoot the gun, you are in trouble. Because if you are convicted, it is death sentence. Okay? So we need to understand this. The second thing we need to understand about the right to life is that it is not absolute. Okay? Like I mentioned earlier, the right to life is that your life cannot be taken away intentionally. So there are some exceptions where the law allows your life or your right to life to be breached or be taken away. And the first exception is if you've committed an offense, a capital offense, and the sentence is death. You can't complain that your right to life is being taken away, because the law provides that such offenses, the punishment is death. Some of those offenses are murder, treason, they are capital offenses. So if you fall in that category, it is an exception. The second exception is all of us, we have what we call the right to private and self-defense. Okay? I know it's contentious. So some of the examples are where somebody comes to your house in the night as an armed robber, wanting to inflict harm to anybody in the house. You have a right to defend yourself, and if in the process that person dies, nobody can say you breach his or her own life. You have the right to self and private defense. Okay, that's one thing we need to understand. However, when you want to exercise that right of self and private defense, you need to be cautious. The first one is that the force you want to use must be commensurate to the danger. The force you are using to repel the attacker must be commensurate to the danger that you face. There's this popular case of, it's an old case. Somebody slapped him, and he shot the person with a gun, and the person dies. So he used excessive force. You can't say the danger you face or the weapon you use, is commensurate to that danger, The second one, which we also need to understand, speaking to those of us who have weapons in our houses or who want to acquire weapons, ensure that you have a license. If you don't have a license, you put yourself in trouble. They will not be talking about the case of use of force. They will be talking about how did you get this weapon. So you need to get a license for your weapon. A recent case I can give you is the case of the suspended CBN governor. The first charge they filed against him in court was that they got a gun in his house and he doesn't have a license for it. And if they are able to prove it, on that alone, he can go to jail for 7 years. So if you have a weapon in your house, ensure you have a license. But that is not our topic of discussion. We're looking at human rights, right to life. Okay? The third exception to the right to life is that if force is used in the process of arresting a suspect or a criminal. So, for instance, the police or the military are on patrol and they saw a crime taking place, especially if it's a violent crime, and they want to arrest the person and the person runs, they are authorized by law to use force. Or if they have arrested the person and he wants to escape, they are authorized to use force. So similar thing that happened in Kuje and some other prisons. So if in the process of trying to arrest the people who escaped from the prison, and if the warders use force or police use force and somebody dies, they can't challenge them that they took away somebody's right. And the last exception is in the process of suppressing or quelling a riot, usually by security forces. They are allowed to use deadly force. And we always encourage people that if you are going out on protest, ensure that you go to a protest that is peaceful. If you join a protest that is violent and they apply force and you die, your family cannot come and call for compensation or challenge what the authorities have done. Remedy for right to life if somebody's life is taken. Of course, the person who has died will not be benefiting from that because you're gone. But your family can ask for compensation, The person who committed the crime can be charged for murder. But there are situations also where if you think that there is a likelihood that your right to life may be breached one way or the other, you can seek for protection. I'm trying to think of a good example. The only one I can think of for now is if maybe the police or the military decides to site a shooting range behind my house. There's a likelihood that somebody in my house can be affected by stray bullets. So I can go to court to restrain them and ask them to please move away from that place. So the likelihood that my right to life will be breached, I can get restraining order. And lastly, like I said, that these rights should not be alien to us as Christians. One of the 10 commandments is that we should not kill. We should not commit murder. So that right is also recognized by the Bible. That's the first right to life. Please, if you have questions that we can take later, or if we can pass to the legal team, and then they can handle that later. The second right, which is also very important, is the right to the dignity of the human person. The right to the dignity of the human person. I gave an example earlier on about the fact that nakedness, it's a dishonor to any human being, So this right seeks to promote human dignity and honor, and it prohibits three things. Three things that are a breach or a violation to anybody's right to dignity of the human person. The first one is torture, or what they call inhumane or degrading treatment. Most times when we talk about torture, people will always refer to what happens in the security services. But of course, we know that sometimes torture occurs in our homes. Good example is the way we treat our house helps. Sometimes people work from early morning, 5 in the morning until 12. I don't think it's humane, for us to treat people like that. Sometimes you see situations where because a mate or a child does something wrong, they pour hot water on the person. This is torture. So let's not look far away. Let's see what happens in our various homes as Christians. The second prohibition is slavery or servitude. I don't know whether we need to define what slavery is, but some of the contemporary forms of slavery are victims of trafficking. When people are trafficked to other parts of the country to go and work in very inhumane conditions and they are not paid, the money they are supposed to be paid goes to maybe an agent or somebody and they get peanuts. Slavery is prohibited. And the third prohibition is forced or compulsory labor. Forced or compulsory labor. I've given an example of what torture is. I think one other example I need to give is children that are accused of witchcraft in some of our communities. The way we treat them. There was one I read, it said, well, for the child to provide evidence that he or she is not a witch, or a wizard, or whatever it is, that the child should drink acid, battery water. And of course, the child died. So these are things that we see on a daily basis, and for us as Christians, let's talk about them. When we see them, let's not keep quiet. This right is absolute, especially the first two prohibitions. Torture, there is no exception to torture. There is no exception to slavery. However, in respect of compulsory and forced labor, there are exceptions. And the first exception is if you are sentenced by a court to go and perform a certain type of labor. Recently, they introduced community service. Your sentence, because you committed an offense, they will ask you to go and be cleaning the hospital or be cutting grass somewhere. You can't say it's a violation of your right. It's a sentence of court, and you need to comply. Second exception is labor that is required of members of the armed forces. It's possible there are certain types of labor that is required of them. If you are in the military, you can't complain that it's a violation of your right. Military and paramilitary. The third exception is in situations of emergency. You may be called upon, perhaps by your community or by your neighborhood, to assist one way or the other. So if it is for the benefit of the community, should not be an issue. And then labor that is required as part of training or as part of national service. So people who are on the National Youth Service Corps, they can't complain of forced labor. Or if it is part of training, I was looking for an example of what I can give here, but the only thing that came to my mind is, so if you are a student reading agric science, and of course you are required to do some practical, to go to the farm or to take care of animals, it's part of your training. So you can't say it is forced or compulsory labor. The Bible emphasizes human dignity because we are all created in the image of God, and there is therefore equality before God. Genesis 1:27. And also in Genesis 3:21, like I said, God made clothes for Adam and Eve to protect their honor and dignity. That's the second right to dignity of the human person. The third one we need to look at is right to personal liberty. Right to personal liberty. And this simply means freedom from all forms of physical restraint, like arrest or detention, until one is convicted of an offense. I know this is a common one that we always talk about, when somebody is arrested by the police or he or she is detained. So here you have a right to personal liberty. You should not be restrained or unduly confined. So if I ask some 3 hefty people to shut the doors to this place and nobody goes in, nobody comes out, I'm infringing on your rights to liberty. I'm not supposed to do that. So the scope of the right includes the following. Now, let me just mention something. If you go into the Constitution, some of these rights are just one sentence. Okay? There's something about our legal system. In jurisprudence, there are different schools of thought. One is that the law is what judges say it is. Okay? So judges are supposed to interpret the law and say this is the intention of the legislature in making this particular law. So some of the things I would say, you may not find them in the Constitution, but because it's an interpretation given by the courts that this is what this means. And that makes judges very powerful. So when we're praying, we should pray for judges. When I was doing jurisprudence in school, one of the questions in an exam they asked us is that judges can make a man a woman and a woman a man discuss. It's a difficult one. But what they are trying to ask us to say is that, look, whatever the parliament says, it is left for the judges to interpret what it means. So if in 3 months' time, the Supreme Court says that 25%, or is it 24% of votes, including FCT, that Tinubu got it or he didn't get it, it is the law. There's nothing anybody can do about it, because they have the power to decide or interpret the law, even though there are guiding principles. So the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes you don't see this in the Constitution, but because the judges, the courts have interpreted it this particular way. So it still forms part of our laws. First scope of the right is that when you are arrested, you have the right to remain silent until you have consulted a lawyer or a person of your choice. So you're not supposed to say anything, and that is why when they arrest somebody, they will tell you that you have a right to remain silent, and anything you say can be used against you in court. They are trying to ensure that this right is respected. So you can decide, to speak, and you can decide to keep quiet. You also have a right to be informed of the reason for the arrest within 24 hours. That is an obligation, although sometimes we know this is obeyed in breach. But this is part of your right to personal liberty. And you have a right to be brought before a court of law within a reasonable time, or you should be released on bail. There are interpretations to what reasonable time means in the Constitution. It talks about a court within a certain distance. Can't remember whether it's 40 kilometers or so. And sometimes it may also depend on the type of case. So if it's a murder case that may require investigations, it could take a longer period of time. And if you are charged and you are in lawful custody, you are not supposed to be kept for a period longer than the sentence if you were convicted. So theft, for instance, I think punishment is 3 years or so. So what this means is that if I've been arrested and I'm in detention, I've not been released on bail, I should not be kept in detention for more than 3 years. There are people that have been in detention without their cases being heard for 10 years, And then at the end of the day, it was discovered that actually they didn't commit that crime, So these issues are important for us, as individuals, but also for our brethren that are working in the security services. Bible says that if we know what is good to do and we fail to do that, it's sin. So if you're in the security services and you're detaining people, to this extent, it's not right, And I hope that we'll be able to take that well. There are exceptions to these rights of liberty. The first one is, of course, execution of a sentence of court. If the court sentences you to 3 years imprisonment, it's an exception. If you fail to comply with an order of court, they can arrest you. So, for instance, if you are a landlord or a landlady and your tenant has gone to court to restrain you from evicting her or him, and you decide to go and bring people to remove the roof because you want to force them out, you can be arrested and brought to court, It's something that happens typically, isn't it? Okay? So if you fail to comply with a court order, you can be arrested. If it is to charge somebody before a court for an offense, so for them to bring you to court, of course, they need to arrest you one way or the other and bring you to court. For the education of persons under 18, so we send our children to school and they stay in boarding houses, and there are rules that, you can't go out of the premises, you can't say that it's a violation of your right. It's an exception to the right to personal liberty. And the last exception is for those with contagious diseases. So remember the case of Ebola, where people are restrained, or COVID. You are restrained, you are not allowed to go anywhere. You can't complain that your right has been affected. Or people that are in need of treatment for certain situations, so drug addicts or people with mental illness, they are allowed to be restrained, to be kept in one place. So that's right number 3, right to personal liberty. Perhaps before we go to the next one, perhaps one suggestion that I will give. If the police invite you for whatever reason, or any security services, please try and inform a relation or inform a lawyer or somebody that will know where you're going to. We've had situations where people have been detained for long and their relations don't know where they are. Some were even presumed dead, and until they were released and they surfaced and say, we didn't know where you are. So try and inform people, especially when you've been invited to the police station. Sometimes those invitations are a subtle way of saying, we want to arrest you. But they won't tell you. It is when you get there, they will ask you to go behind the counter. Right number 4 is right to fair hearing. This is also very important. It's important to the other rights too. Right to fair hearing simply means that where a decision is going to be taken on your rights and obligations, the process must be very fair. Okay? So if your office is setting up a disciplinary committee, let me use that example, especially for our fathers that are in high positions, ensure that the committee will be very fair. I think that is what it means. So whether disciplinary committee or even when you are going to court, the law requires that the process that will lead to that decision is fair. Fair hearing requires the following: that the court or tribunal or authority determining the case or matter must be impartial. It must be an impartial body. There's one typical example that we were given. In 1986, I hope I'm correct, there was a riot by students in the University of Maiduguri. And it led to the burning down of the house of the Deputy Vice Chancellor. So the school set up a disciplinary committee. And the disciplinary committee found some of the students. There's one particular chap, his name was Garba. He was like the focal person for the riot. They found them, I don't want to use the word guilty. They found them liable. And they were dismissed from school. So they went to court to challenge it. That committee was not an impartial committee. For the simple reason that during the riot, the house of the Deputy Vice Chancellor was burned, and incidentally, he was made the chairman of the committee. So there was no how for the results to be fair. Even if the results were fair, anybody looking at this will say, look, we don't expect a fair hearing. So their dismissal from school was set aside by the Supreme Court, So the committee, if we set up disciplinary committees, they should be impartial bodies. The second one is that, which is similar, that there will be no likelihood of bias in the case. The example I will give is the case of MKO Abiola. I hope most of us know Abiola. In the 1993 elections, it was said that he won the election, but it was not declared. It was not fully declared. So he went and declared himself as president. And the then head of state, Abacha, arrested him. And he was tried for treason. So in the course of the trial, he appealed against certain decisions of the High Court. Case went to Court of Appeal, and then it subsequently went to Supreme Court. Now, prior to this, he had a newspaper house called the Concord Newspapers. And Concord Newspapers had published an allegation against the justices of the Supreme Court, that they collected money from the former head of state, that is Babangida. Babangida bought cars for them. And Concord wrote in the newspaper that they were bought over. And the judges that were affected, they sued Concord newspaper for libel. And Concord was found liable. So, when his own case, he's the owner of Concord, okay, and it was Concord that was sued. When his own case for treason, he appealed against certain decisions and it went to the Supreme Court. And of course, the Supreme Court, it was a constitutional case. They are supposed to constitute a panel of 7 judges to try the case. It was a normal process. The judges that had sued his newspaper were about 9. And unfortunately for us, if you take out those 9, there won't be sufficient judges to try his case. So he filed a case before the Supreme Court and said a motion that the 9 judges that sued his newspaper cannot try his case because there will be a likelihood of bias because they had sued his newspaper. And any reasonable man will say that, look, if these judges are the ones to do this case, we don't think this person will get fair hearing. And the Supreme Court agreed with them that, look, 9 of you, you can't do this man's case. But like I said, unfortunately, after taking those 9, they couldn't form a quorum to do his case, the remaining, I can't remember what happened with that case, but that was what happened. So there shouldn't be any likelihood of bias if you want to hold somebody responsible for something. Each person in a case must be listened to or heard. So in criminal cases must be in public. So for criminal cases, it must be in public. And there should be a presumption of innocence. What we call that, the person that has sued you or the person that is prosecuting the case has the responsibility of proving that you are guilty. So you have the right not to even say anything and wait for them to prove their own case. So you have a presumption of innocence. And this is very important in our criminal justice system, such that we have this saying that it is better to release 10 guilty people, than to punish 1 innocent person. So you have 10 people who may have committed murder. But it's better to release them than to sentence to death somebody who didn't commit. Because you are violating not just that person, but even a sense of justice of the community. So presumption of innocence is very important. You are entitled to an interpreter. So if I don't understand the language of the court, I'm entitled to an interpreter. I'm entitled to a legal practitioner if I don't have one, especially in capital offenses. If I don't have one, the state is supposed to provide me with a lawyer. It's mandatory that I must have a lawyer to represent me. That I must also be tried under an existing and a written law if it's a criminal case. So if I did something wrong to the government today, if that thing is not an offense today, they cannot tomorrow enact a law and backdate it and say I'm guilty of that offense. Like we said earlier, in Genesis, God listened to Adam and Eve before he pronounced judgment on them. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 15 to 16, Moses charged leaders to judge fairly and impartially amongst the people and between the Israelites and non-Israelites. And as Christians, I said we must create an opportunity to enable people to be heard. Let's not look too far away, but even in our homes, we should give opportunity for people to be heard. When I was preparing for this, I remember what happened in my home, I think some 4 years ago. We have this family tradition. Either on the 31st of December or on the 1st of January, we meet as a family to discuss the previous year, what has worked well and what has not worked. With the children, we discuss that. And what we want to see going forward in the next year. So I think about 4 years ago, my 4-year-old son, in the course of the discussion, so he said that he doesn't know why, if there is a dispute between him and his sisters, that we always listen to them. We don't listen to him. I was taken aback, you know. So we have to apologize and say that we'll make amends. So let's create that opportunity at the home front to ensure that people are heard. Feedback is important so that the family can run well. I will jump the right to private and family life. I will jump freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Freedom of expression and the press. We have the right to hold our opinions and to express our opinions and to receive and impart ideas. I like this right because if you look at human civilization and development, if not for this right, there are certain scientific developments that, you know, if they were suppressed, if people were not allowed to do research that help humanity, it would have been difficult to make some of the advances that we have today. Academic freedom is important, you know. So this right is important not just for individuals, but it's also important for groups as well. It allows organizations to establish media houses and even schools because it's part of imparting knowledge. So Bingham University is also part of our exercise of our right, you know, of expression and press because we use that to impart knowledge. There are exceptions to this right. One is a breach of confidentiality. So if I go for confession before Reverend Nathan, if tomorrow he makes that known to the church, that I came to him and I confessed for adultery, I can sue you, sir. So doctor-patient relationship, lawyer-client relationship, confidentiality is important. There's also, there are regulations. The last time we have a brother who came here and talked about Radio Elwa. One of the challenges was we need a license. So even though you have the right to establish a media house, you must follow the regulation. You can't say that regulation breaches your right to own a media house. You cannot report court proceedings anyhow in exercise of your freedom. That may be contempt of court, especially if you comment and critique an ongoing case. It could also, if you don't exercise your right well, it could lead to defamation. I've given an example. So when you are exercising your freedom of expression, be careful because it can injure another person. Let me jump this to the right to private property. So as Christians, we are shown how in the Bible, you know, people who have acquired so much, if you look at the life of the children of Israel, in exercise of that right. For us in Nigeria, the law allows us to acquire property in any part of the country. That's what the law says. Immovable property, I think that's what the Constitution says. But of course, there are some restrictions. The first one is, you know, if you have a property, it can be taken, you know, on various grounds, public policy for the interest of the community. However, there must be adequate compensation for you. And you have also to be part of the determination of what is adequate as compensation. On Friday, we discussed here that if you want to acquire property, in particular, if it is a property that is subject of a will, make sure you look at that will. It's possible the person who left that will say that property should not be sold. And if you're buying it, you're buying court case for yourself. And you know that land cases, they take a lot of time in Nigeria before they finish. I had one example. When Erufai was selling government houses, myself and my wife went and bought one. We went to take possession and we found somebody in the house. It was sold to him too. My wife said we should just go and collect our money. I said, no, let's go to court. We spent 7 years in court. And I think the money we spent in the case is more than the money we paid for the house. Don't buy a court case for yourself, even though you have a right to acquire property. I will jump the other rights because our time is far spent. I will go to how to enforce your rights. Part of what we are doing is imparting knowledge. Knowledge is important when you know that you are able to exercise your rights well. You can approach the courts to exercise your rights, to enforce your rights. You can approach any of the government institutions that are responsible for enforcing rights: the National Human Rights Commission, Public Complaints Commission, Citizens' Rights Centers, Legal Aid Council. Law enforcement agencies, too, is part of their responsibility to enforce the law, including your rights. You can approach private lawyers and NGOs, colleagues who are lawyers here. What are the remedies? Compensation, public apology, restraining order, restitution, and punishment for those who violate your rights. I mentioned earlier there are limitations to human rights. There's one simple limitation. They say that your right to swing your fist stops where your neighbor's nose begins. So I have a right to swing my fist. But of course, I can't swing it to the extent that it punches somebody on the nose. So when we're exercising our rights, we should know that there are also obligations attached to it. So I can play my music in my house, but if it becomes a nuisance to others, it can be a problem for me. We'll talk about the exception earlier on. Economic empowerment or lack of it is also an issue because sometimes it will require you to go to court to enforce your rights. Like I said, my case I was in court for 7 years. We run an imperfect system, okay? Ordinarily, these things should be simple. But because of a number of things, corruption and the rest of them, it's sometimes difficult to get these rights to be enforced. As Christians, we are encouraged to do good to all men and women. So this is not just for us to exercise our rights, but to ensure that we don't violate the rights of others. If we can't help those that are in need, that their rights have been violated, let us not be the oppressors. I've mentioned earlier, we have institutions where I believe children of God work in, and those institutions are responsible for enforcing the rights of others. Let's ensure that we do our work well. It is good for us to respect the rights of others. It is also good for us, to support them when their rights are being violated. There is a saying here, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. If we do nothing, it breeds impunity. People will continue to violate the rights of others because they will say nothing will happen, So let's not keep quiet when we see this happens. It's a reference to Proverbs 24. The last thing I would mention is that with the rise in individuality, we should also exercise our rights with some sense of decency. If you look at the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of association, especially to our young people, let's exercise these rights with some sense of decency. So freedom of expression also includes wearing dresses that show what you think about life or your opinion. But sometimes we go overboard, to be indecent in terms of exercising our rights. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you all. Can I have the lawyers stand up, please? In case anybody has any question. or any issue, feedback, please, you can meet them and they can help out. God bless you all. Like I said, I have cut this short. There are other rights in the Constitution. You can read that. And if you have any question, please meet any of the brethren. Thank you very much.
Things about Ekwa Asokoro. We're a church that desires to continually study God's word, continually grow in fellowship with one another, continually grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ, and then ultimately be instruments in God's hand to reach out to the people who are around us. We will be happy if you're in Abuja at any time to visit us at Linda Choka Crescent, plot 2904, Asokoro. We'll be wonderfully glad to have you join us, have fellowship with us. Scrolling under your screen are all our social media handles, and you can join us on any of them. On Telegram, you get the audio version of all our sermons, so you can join us there. All our social media handles use the same name, Ekwa Asokoro. So just check them out and join us. It will be wonderful if you keep this fellowship of being with us from time to time. On Tuesdays, we get to meet. There's Bible study. Join us also on Tuesdays, and you will have a wonderful time. Thank you again for joining us, and God bless you.